Okay, but, and we're going to talk about this today. Here's the deal with the spinal cord. The spinal cord ends about L1 or L2, but the meninges do not end at L1 or L2. The meninges go down all the way to S2 or S3, okay? So that means that, for instance, as we talked about before, if you were going to remove cerebrospinal fluid, like with a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, right? They don't need to go anywhere near the CNS tissue to actually get cerebrospinal fluid. So you can go well below L2, and they're generally going to go between L3 and L4, L4 and L5. You can suck out cerebrospinal fluid, right? In order to do that, you would have to go through the dura mater into the arachnoid, into the subarachnoid space, right? And remember, we talked about this before, they can examine the cerebrospinal fluid as an initial indication of what's going on with the central nervous system. They can look for white blood cells, which is an indication that there's some kind of infection and will make the cerebrospinal fluid kind of milky, kind of opaque instead of clear. They can also look for chemical content, waste products, all of that kind of stuff in there. As I mentioned before, cancer also doesn't tend to stay put, so you might even find some cancerous or precancerous cells in cerebrospinal fluid, depending on what they're looking for. So that's a lumbar puncture or spinal tap. But of course, we remember, so now that we're around the spinal cord, that you can also do an epidural injection, and an epidural injection does not go through the dura mater, right? It goes into the epidural space. And depending on where you put it, remember, the epidural injection does not deaden the central nervous system tissue, which isn't actually sensory or motor, it's just integration, and we don't want to lose integration. What it does is it deadens the PNS tissue that comes out of that region, right? So depending on where you put it into the epidural space, you will get different deadening. Does that make sense? Okay. It also, since all of these nerves are mixed, you lose sensory and motor capacity, like when you actually do an epidural injection. Okay. So now let's just briefly talk about the spinal nerves. I'll teach you how they're named and numbered, and then we'll get into more detail about that later when we do the plexuses. But when you are talking about spinal nerves are the spinal cord equivalent of cranial nerves, right? And there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and we just got into some detail about what they do and which hole they go through, sensory, motor, or both. Luckily, the spinal nerves, although there are more of them, the naming convention is simpler, and the functionality is a little simpler as well, at least at the level you have to learn it. Okay, so the naming convention is simply they are named for where they come out of the vertebral column, okay? And so we've got the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, the sacral region, and the coccygeal region, right? Okay, and you guys remember the number of vertebrae in each region, right? How many cervical vertebrae? 7. How many thoracic vertebrae? 12. Lumbar? 5. Sacral? 5. And then coccygeal is variable, anywhere from 1 to 5 to people have a tail sometimes. Go ahead. Yeah, that's what I was about to get to. So the only hard thing about this naming convention is this. Listen, they are generally named for the vertebra above them, but in the cervical region, the first one starts just below the foramen magnum, so we end up with one more cervical spinal nerve. We end up with 8. Does that make sense? Okay, so they are C1 through C8, and if you were going to say out the whole name, those are cervical spinal nerves 1 through 8. You with me? Okay, T1 through T12, thoracic spinal nerves. Okay, L1 through L5, lumbar. S1 through S5. There's only one coccygeal, but C1 was taken. Yes? C1 means cervical, so it's C01, the little knot symbol. Okay? So that's how they're numbered and named. But it's important to understand that they continue even after the spinal cord ends. So they're not named for where they leave the spinal cord, they're named for where they leave the vertebral column. Does that make sense to you? Okay, because the spinal cord ends at L1 or L2, but we have a lot of spinal nerves after that. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so yes, there is an extra cervical spinal nerve up here, C1 through C8, and we'll come back to those in naming and everything. But big picture understanding that we talked about before, generally speaking, what they are going to do is have mixed sensory and motor function for the region that is just below them, okay? So The cervical spinal nerves do neck muscles and neck sensation mostly. There's always exceptions to this, right? These right here, the lower cervical and upper thoracic, go to the arms. The rest of the thoracic mostly do like the intercostal muscles and not a whole hell of a lot else, because remember the vagus nerve took care of innervating most of your ventral body cavities. There's not a whole hell of a lot for them to do. The lumbar ones do most of the thigh. The sacral ones do junk and the rest of the leg. Just an oversimplification. Good? Okay, and there's exceptions to each of those, but just a big picture, okay? Everybody good? Okay, so let's look at the gross anatomical structures of the spinal cord just to sort of get into the big picture of it. So when you look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, basically it starts at the foramen magnum, it generally ends around L2, okay? So let's look at how it ends, and it's kind of hard to see this. It's really easy to see in the lab. So first thing is that the spinal cord's a little chubbier up in the cervical region, then it gets relatively narrow, and then it gets chubby again in the lumbar region. Any idea why it might be a little wider in the cervical region and in the lumbar region? It doesn't have to do with movement, it has to do with what it's innervating. What does the cervical region innervate that you might need a lot of back and forth to? The arms and the hands. Yeah, lots and lots of fibers coming and going to the arms and hands. And then the thoracic doesn't have a whole hell of a lot to do, but what does the lumbar do? Legs, exactly. So they call that, even though it's not super visible in this picture, it is visible in the cadavers. The cervical enlargement and then the lumbar enlargement. Good? Okay, and then the end of the spinal cord proper is like a cone. Okay, now if you look at it in an actual cadaver, you can really see it. So follow me for just a second. Okay, it's called the Conus Medullaris. I'm going to draw a line around it. That cone-shaped end of the spinal cord proper. Do you see it? And it's got little hairy stuff coming off the sides. The hairy stuff coming off the sides is PNS tissue, not CNS tissue. The Conus Medullaris is the end of the spinal cord proper, and it literally means cone in the middle. Okay? Is that okay? So the Conus Medullaris is the cone in the middle of the spinal cord proper. It ends, comes to a point, but then there is an anchoring, kind of like a tendon. This little guy right here, which is called the filum terminale, it's a different color than the stuff around it. It's not nervous tissue. It's connective tissue wrapped in pia mater, and it anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. Filum terminale means last hair. Okay, so we have the cone in the middle, we have the last hair, and it anchors to the coccyx. And then one other structure that you can see down here, all of this nervous tissue, there is a whole bunch of nervous tissue both around the end of the spinal cord and after the spinal cord ends, and you can see it all here, right? Okay, but that's all PNS tissue and not CNS tissue, right? And you can see it wrapping around the conus medullaris and then continuing down. That is all collectively called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. Okay, everybody good? Okay, so now let me ask you, what is the end of the spinal cord called? Conus medullaris. What is the structure that attaches the spinal cord to the coccyx? Filum terminale. What is all the PNS tissue that continues in the vertebral canal after the spinal cord ends? Cauda equina. So that's all of that stuff. Does that make sense to you? And it's actually pretty easy to see with the spinal cord dissections on the cadavers. You should definitely go see it. Just to get the appreciation for like how narrow that damn spinal cord is. It's amazing. Okay, so next thing we need to do is cut the spinal cord in cross-section and then look at the structures and try to figure out how we can tell where we are. So if you look at the spinal cord in cross-section and you got the vertebra around it, telling anterior from posterior is cake because we all know that the spine's processes are posterior. But do you always have the vertebra around it? You do not. So that means you need to have another way to tell, yes? Okay, and there are a million ways to do it. I'll tell you the two that are really dependable for me. The two that are really dependable for me is the shape of the gray matter is very, very dependable. It varies a little bit from the cervical to the thoracic to the lumbar region, but this part of it is consistent, okay? So it looks like kind of like an H. Do you see it? Okay. Or do you know what a swallowtail butterfly looks like? The one with the round wings on the top and the pointy wings on the back? Okay. This swallowtail butterfly is always flying forward toward the front of your body. The pointy wings are always toward the back, posterior. You with me? Okay. And the pointy wings always touch the meninges. The top one doesn't. Do you see that one reaching all the way to the meninges? With that in mind, you should be able to tell on any figure anterior and posterior. Does that make sense? So you can tell on that one, you can tell on that one, you can tell on this one. Can you tell? Okay, even if it wasn't labeled, just by the shape of the gray matter. Is that okay? Okay. The other thing that you can use is this structure right here. So coming and going from the spinal cord are what we call roots. Okay, and the roots are going to have a posterior one and then an anterior one. Only the posterior one will have a lump on it called a ganglion. But that correlates to what we just learned, right? The posterior one has a lump and the butterfly wings are going backwards, right? So that's either called the posterior root ganglion or the dorsal root ganglion. And no matter what picture you look at, they are both going to be associated with the backside of the spinal cord. Is that okay? Okay, so you always have to, before you start identifying things, tell anterior from posterior, because half the crap in the spinal cord is called the anterior this, the posterior this, the lateral that. Okay, so everybody okay with that? Okay, obviously if you got the vertebra around, it's cake, but you don't always have it. Okay, so when you look at the spinal cord structures in cross section, you got gray matter and white matter, but each little chunk of gray matter and white matter has a different name. But it's easy because you just learned anterior from posterior. So when you're looking at the white matter, first off, what is the white matter? Well, it's a bunch of myelinated axons. Most of them are going up and down, so most of them are what kind of tracks? Projection. Most of them are projection tracks. Not all of them, but most of them. Okay? And so white matter on the outside, a whole bunch of myelinated axons, and then gray matter in the middle. So the gray matter is what gray matter is, which is neuron cell bodies, dendrites, unmyelinated axons, right? That's what that is. And then this is kind of all wiring. Good? Okay. So what you call the gray matter, let's do that first. The gray matter is called horns. So I have an anterior horn, a posterior horn, and then sometimes a lateral horn. Okay, I call them gray horns because that's the way that I learned them. So the anterior gray horn is pointing forward, right? The posterior gray horns is those back wings of the butterfly. And then the lateral gray horns are only in certain regions of the spinal cord. Okay, like the cervical region doesn't have lateral horns, but if you see something sticking out to the side, it's called the lateral horn. Everybody okay with that? Okay, we're going to figure out what's going on in those in just a second. We're going to put some structure function together. Okay, but then you've also got this little chunk of gray matter that connects the left to the right side, and that's called the gray commissure, because commissures connect left and right, although they're usually white matter. Good? With me? Okay. And then there's a hole in the gray commissure. What's that hole? It's the central canal of the spinal cord, right? And what's in there? Yeah, cerebrospinal fluid is in there. Good? Okay. So that's all the gray matter. Now let's look at the white matter. White matter is pretty easy, except that your textbook wants to call it a funiculus. Most textbooks call it a white column. Can you understand why it would be a white column? Because it's white matter that's going up and down your spinal cord. You can use the term funiculus if you want. Most students like white column. But regardless, this is anterior white columns. Yes? Posterior white columns. Good. Lateral white columns. What do you think you call this part? It's a white commissure. Commissure that connects the two halves, right? White commissure. Good? Make sense? Okay. Anterior, posterior, and lateral. Everybody all right with that? Okay. You can use funiculus if you want to. Most of you won't. A funiculus, have you ever ridden a funicular? In Europe, that's what they call like a tram that you use to ride up a mountain. So they called these the funiculus, right? Tram is easier to say. Okay. So white matter, gray matter, got that. Okay, so what else do we have to know to look at an anatomical structure and cross-section? We have to be able to find the roots, right? And then there are also some depressions that have names as well. So on the anterior portion, this is called the anterior median fissure. If you have a good picture or a good specimen, it's usually pretty deep. And then this one's called the posterior median sulcus because it's usually a little less deep. Okay, anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. And then let's look at the actual roots. Okay, so you guys are going to do this week. We're about to put structure together with function. The things that are closest to the spinal cord are called roots. The little bitty ones are rootlets. They come together to form a root. With me? So this would be the dorsal or posterior root with the ganglion on it, right? Okay. This is anterior rootlets coming together to form anterior root. Good. When the dorsal, anterior and posterior roots come together, they actually form a nerve. This is a nerve. Posterior root with posterior root ganglion. These are the rootlets, right? Anterior rootlets, anterior root come together to form a nerve. Good? All right. And we're about to put things through it in just a second. Okay, so now what I want to do is start putting some function together with the structure, right? So what does the spinal cord do? Well, it does a lot of things, but let's get one thing, sort of an idea about what it does. The spinal cord does the simplest kinds of reflexes that you have. They're called spinal reflexes, okay? And a spinal reflex is simply stimulus response, stimulus response. There's no intellectual processing that goes on because, of course, the gray matter of your spinal cord is not part of your intellectual processing organ, okay? But it still can make some decisions, but think of them as yes, no, ones and zero kind of decisions. So what's going to happen with the spinal cord is that if I put my hand on a hot stove, the information comes up through nerves, yes, and then goes in through the backside of my spinal cord, that's sensory, and then goes through the spinal cord and then comes out the anterior portion of my spinal cord, that's motor, and then back to the muscle. So let's look. In this situation, somebody is getting poked with a pin and twitching in response, okay? First question, based on the stuff that you've learned, what kind of sensory information is this? What kind of sensory, what?
Somatic.
Somatic sensory information. And if you respond by twitching a skeletal muscle, then it's somatic motor. Okay, now the spinal cord does other things besides somatic, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but this is just a simple somatic reflex, okay? So you're gonna poke, and what's gonna happen is that sensory information is going to go through the nerve, with me, and then through the posterior or dorsal root, where it finds the cell body of that sensory neuron, right? Then it's going to go and synapse in the gray matter of the spinal cord. With what kind of neuron is this functionally? Interneuron, good. And this interneuron is the switch flipper, 1 or 0. Respond or don't respond, right? Okay. And if it says respond, then what it's going to do is going to synapse with this motor neuron, and that one is going to go out the anterior root, back out probably the same nerve, and then go to the effector, which is the skeletal muscle. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's put that together with your notes too. Oh, by the way, interestingly, right, if somebody pokes me with a pin and then I respond, what I am saying is that my cerebral cortex is not involved in the response. This is faster than a cerebral cortex response, a voluntary response, but I do send up a flag to my cerebral cortex that it occurred. But I'm not involving it in the decision-making process. I'm just telling it that it occurred. What is the advantage to doing that? What? It's faster to just go through the spinal cord, but why tell the brain at all?
It happens again.
Exactly, right? You need to learn that pointy things are sharp and that stoves are hot and that sometimes things hurt you, and you need to remember that boy that you like, you need to learn that he's not good for you. That's what you need to learn. And it needs to go out to your brain, right? Okay? That's a way more complicated decision, but same kind of thing, you know? That one that you're attracted to, not that one. Okay, so let's fill this in. So a spinal reflex and the reflex arc. The anatomical structures. You have a sensory receptor. This happens to be a somatic sensory receptor, right? And the sensory receptor is going to activate a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron has its cell body in the blank blank ganglion. Posterior root ganglion or dorsal root ganglion, yes? Posterior root ganglion. So let's address this really quickly. Who remembers what structural category of neuron that is? Structural? Unipolar. Why not a multipolar neuron? If it were a multipolar neuron, then the cell body would have to be all the way out here. Does that sound really safe?
No.
No. So you get it way more protected by having it all the way snuggled up close to the spinal cord right here. It's really close to the intervertebral foramen. It's got a lot of protection in that area. So the information goes through the posterior root ganglion and the posterior root. This isn't showing the rootlets, but of course the rootlets would be there as well. So posterior root, and then it can synapse with an interneuron, and that's what she said, right? The interneuron right there. The interneuron is just the decision maker, 1 or 0, yes or no. But interestingly, there are even simpler reflexes than this that don't need an interneuron. Because if you always responded to the sensory information with the same motor output, do you need a switch?
No.
No. So you just synapse the sensory with the motor, right? And then you have it's called a monosynaptic reflex. It's the simplest reflex that you have. It always responds exactly the same way to exactly the same stimulus, right? But this one actually has a little decision making in the middle. Okay, so does it make sense to you? Go ahead.
So maybe I missed this somewhere, but so the solar body of that sensory neuron, there's just only one. The rest of it is all an axon.
Yes, this is all an axon. These are the dendrites right here.
So there's just only the one head and the whole axon's like all the way to say the finger.
Yes. So no neuron cell bodies out here to speak of at all until you get that sensory information right near the spinal cord, right? Because think about how frequently they would get damaged because, right, we are not particularly gentle with our peripheral regions and our skin, right? So the sensory neurons are all nice and protected right near the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So
But there's thousands of dendrites. I mean, like,
there are thousands of dendrites, yeah.
I'm just saying the head, basically.
Yeah, the neuron cell body is way far away from the actual sensory receptor. Okay, and does it make sense to you that this neuron cell body is actually in gray matter? Yeah? Okay. This neuron cell body is in gray matter, but it's in a specific location. The motor neuron, the cell body of the motor neuron, I want you to notice, is generally going to be in what horn? That's the anterior horn. It's going to be in the anterior horn. Good. Okay. And then its axon is going to run through what root? What is this root? Anterior root, right? Come back together to form a nerve, right? And then go out to the effector, which in this instance is skeletal muscle, right? So this is a relatively simple reflex. It's called a polysynaptic or disynaptic reflex. There is a monosynaptic one. Now, I'm not going to hold you responsible for this particular part, but I do want to show you that the spinal cord doesn't just do somatic sensations and somatic motor activity. The spinal cord does lots of stuff. I don't test over this. I just want you to see it for the first time. So here is what the spinal cord is actually doing. So please note, still sensory, right? But somatic sensory and then visceral sensory. That's where they're sequestered, right? Still motor, but autonomic and somatic, right? They're sequestered at different portions in the spinal cord, right? And you can see the spinal cord actually light up with different types of activity. So if, for instance, our diarrhea example would have come in with a visceral sensation activating an autonomic output. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so I don't usually ask this particular picture. It's a little more complicated than people like to get, and I've got other things to do. Okay, so the information, as I mentioned, may also be sent to the cerebral cortex of the brain because you need to log the information about pain, especially, and threat and sensation for future reference. But the cerebral cortex didn't make the decision. It wasn't involved in the decision-making process. Everybody good? Yes? You guys are quiet. Yeah? Okay, so the next thing that we are going to talk about is the concept of spinal nerves and plexuses. It seems like it should be plexi, but it's not. It's plexuses, nexuses. So with that, what we are going to do is we are going to get a big picture understanding and then start drilling down a little further. So when we look at spinal nerves, this is only showing the left side of the spinal nerve, but there are actually two sides, right? This is just left spinal nerves. They're all paired. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they are all mixed in function, and that's important for you to understand. Unlike the cranial nerves, which were sensory motor, or some of them were both, right? These are all mixed in function, okay? And so what's going to happen is the dorsal and the ventral roots, so here we go, are going to come together. And this is where students get confused, so pay attention to this part. So here's the dorsal or posterior root, here's the ventral or anterior root. They come together to form a nerve right here. This right here is a spinal nerve right there, and it's labeled right there, okay? But the spinal nerve almost immediately branches, okay? And it branches into the word for branch, which is ramus, okay? But when it branches, it doesn't branch based on functionality, it just branches based on location. So I'm going to have this ramus, called the posterior ramus, that goes and innervates just the stuff, sensory and motor, that is posterior to the spinal cord. There isn't a whole hell of a lot back there, comparatively speaking, is there? So look at the size of the posterior ramus compared to the size of the anterior ramus. Do you see? Okay. So the posterior ramus is really going to be responsible for innervating the sensations on your back, right? And probably muscles like the erector spinae muscles. Does that make sense? And you actually don't even learn innervation of those. So that's the posterior ramus. We don't do a whole hell of a lot about the posterior ramus simply because the anterior ramus is going to innervate everything anterior to the spinal cord, which includes your limbs, right? And all of the muscles, almost all the muscles that you learned will be innervated by this anterior ramus. Does that make sense? So when you look at this picture right here, the spinal nerves that it's actually showing are only the anterior rami of the spinal nerves. Posterior rami were cut off with this particular picture. Does that make sense? And they don't form plexuses because there's not a whole hell of a lot going on with them. Okay, so dorsal and ventral roots come together to form a spinal nerve. Spinal nerves are all mixed in function. They contain sensory processes from the dorsal root and motor processes from the ventral root. Where do spinal nerves leave the vertebral column? What's that little hole between vertebrae called? The intervertebral foramen, plural is foramina, right? So that's where they leave, okay? And that's why they're labeled what they're labeled. Right? They're labeled for the intervertebral foramen that they leave through, except this weird one right here. Everybody good? Okay. All right. So they are usually, as I mentioned, named for the vertebra above them, with the exception of that extracervical spinal one. And each spinal nerve branches almost immediately into a dorsal ramus or a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus. And so what the anterior ramus is going to do is going to innervate everything anterior to the spinal cord. So here what I want to do to make sure this makes sense is to practice this with a couple of examples. You ready? Okay. So what I want to do, let's do an easy one first. Let's do the hand on the hot stove example. And what I want to do is I'm going to get it up a nerve. You don't have to know which nerve yet. Eventually you will know which nerve. Okay. Then I'm going to get it through a ramus, spinal nerve, figure out which root to go through, right? And then figure out which portions of the gray matter and then get it all the way back out to the muscle. Okay, so we'll do the first one together. I'm going to put my hand on a hot stove, okay? And the information is going to go relatively quickly through my spinal cord. Bonus to anybody who knows which region of the spinal cord it goes through. Yeah, it goes to the cervical region of the spinal cord. Okay, but now get it in. So I've got it going through, but before it can get to a root, it's got to go through a ramus. Somebody tell me which ramus it's going to go through. Anterior ramus. Why? Because it's coming from the front of the spinal cord. Everybody with me? Okay. Anterior ramus. And then it's going to go through this little portion right here, which is the spinal nerve. Now let's get that sensory information into the spinal cord. Now where? Posterior root through the ganglion, right? Synapse in the gray matter. With me? Posterior gray horn, and then the motor neuron is going to be in the anterior gray horn, right? Send that motor information out what first? Root or ramus? Anterior rootlet in the root, right? And then out through, what's this called? Spinal nerve, and then out through which ramus? Anterior ramus, because I'm moving my arms. With me? Okay, now I'm going to do a different one. See if you can figure this one out. I have an itch on my back. I'm going to reach my arm around and scratch it. Okay? Itch on my back. Okay? All right, so it's going through a nerve. Yes? And then it's going to go up through which ramus?
Posterior Ramus.
Posterior ramus. Why?
On your back.
Because it was on my back. From the posterior ramus, I will go where? Spinal nerve. And then where?
Posterior Root.
Posterior root and the ganglion, right? In through posterior gray horn, anterior gray horn. Now what?
Anterior Root.
Anterior root. Now what? Spinal nerve. Now where?
Anterior Ramus.
Anterior ramus. Why? Got to go to my hands. Does that make sense? So that's the whole concept of roots and rami. So I'm going to reinforce. Rami are not about functionality. They're about location. But roots are exclusively sensory or motor, so they're about functionality. Does that make sense? Kind of got the picture of that? Okay, all right, cool. So the ventral rami are so big that they almost immediately split and start branching into a whole bunch of nerves, right? And almost all of the nerves of your body, here down, are branches of the ventral rami and not the dorsal rami. The dorsal rami don't do very much. Almost all of the nerves of your body that you're going to be learning this week, and you actually don't learn any nerves in this class that are branches of the posterior rami. All of these guys are actually anterior rami branches. So the anterior or ventral rami are going to start to form little wads of nerves. And a little wad of nerves is called a plexus, okay? And you've only got 4 plexuses. Here's one. This is called the cervical plexus, which is a bunch of nerves that, to oversimplify, primarily does sensation and muscular activity in the neck. And you didn't even learn most of the neck muscles that it does. You've got a whole bunch of neck strap muscles right here that are innervated by the cervical plexus. You did learn one of them. But so the cervical plexus primarily does here. And then this right here is called the brachial plexus. And the brachial plexus goes to the arm, right? And it's a big honker. And you're going to learn a whole bunch of the nerves of the brachial plexus. That's actually the one that you learn in most of the detail. It's not as hard as you originally think it is, and we'll go through it in detail next time. So that's the brachial plexus. The thoracic spinal nerves don't form a plexus. They just run parallel to one another, and they don't ever wad up. So there's no plexus there, right? They just stay parallel. In addition, like I mentioned, the thoracic region doesn't actually innervate as much as you would imagine because the whole ventral body cavity was taken care of by cranial nerve. So what's this primarily doing? Does it surprise you that it's doing somatic sensation, yeah, and then intercostal muscles, right? That's primarily what that does. Good. And then this is called the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus primarily goes anterior to the os coxa. And what it mostly does is innervates the thigh, a little bit of your junk, not that much of it. And then the sacral plexus innervates the rest of your junk, like your anal sphincter too. And then it actually innervates the rest of your leg. Cool? So that's what these plexuses do. So what you are going to do in lecture and in lab, and we'll start on that next time, you guys are just ahead of the other class, is that you will learn select nerves out of each plexus, okay? Not that many. It's not that hard. The only plexus that's actually kind of hard is the brachial plexus, but it actually gets really simple after you practice with it a little bit because there's a process of elimination you can go through to learn the nerves. So we're going to pick up there next time, and we'll practice all the plexuses and figure out what they innervate on the board. Cool? You have a brain quiz up. It's due by Wednesday. Make sure you get it done.